I was at Symantec, been at ArcSight, spent some time in the MSSP business and the SIM business, and as somebody who very nicely created my slide here, I also happen to love the Smiths and other 80s sad timey music. Ryan, who's not on the call yet, I guess I get to go ahead and introduce him as well. He is one of my colleagues on the on our security specialist team, and works a number of different things doing research, and has spent a good chunk of time within government and outside of government doing cyber kinds of things. So today, what I'm going to go through is we're going to do a little bit of a brief introduction to threat hunting. The challenge when we have a diverse group of folks is that I don't necessarily know where everybody's coming from, so I kind of want to assume that we need to kind of set a baseline that we're working with. So some folks who may have been do this for years, you may be a little bit bored at the beginning. I apologize for that. But for those of you who aren't maybe as familiar with threat hunting, it gives us an opportunity to make sure that everybody's kind of starting on that same page. We're going to be using a data set that is based on a scenario that we use for what's referred to as boss of the SOC. This is an adversary simulation data set that we've turned into a blue team capture the flag exercise that we do for folks around the world, and have done this for the past 2+ years now. And so there's a backstory that goes along with that. We want to share that backstory just as kind of contextual information, because again, when you're hunting within your environment, you want to make sure that you have some of those additional pieces of context. And then the last thing that we're going to do as we move through that context is then we're going to move into our hunting scenarios, and realizing that we only have about 2 hours worth of time, I want to be cognizant of that. And so we've kind of identified 3 specific scenarios that we could potentially be focusing on. Within this is assumption of breach and going in and looking for the badness. We're not waiting for the alerts to come. We're going to go find things that would indicate problems within our environment. Okay? So as we're talking about this, this is kind of the classic Zeus example, and I'll just kind of show you what this looks like. But essentially what we're doing, is going to go ahead and steal a piece of information from the website. We're going to go ahead and weaponize that PDF. We're going to send it back into the organization. When that PDF is opened by an unwitting person, there spawns some sort of nasty processes. We're going to go ahead and establish a connection inbound to outbound, and the adversary is going to go ahead and take action upon that and do whatever they're going to do. Right? That's kind of the garden variety advanced threat. What's important to understand is there's lots of different data sets that I need to be able to get insight into that. If my antivirus is not going to catch that, or my IDS is not going to get that, there's a number of other different things that I can use to gain insight into these things, but I need to have logs, operating system logs, what's starting up. I need to have, firewall, router, other kinds of network telemetry data to see which way data is moving within the environment. I need to have context, right? Which assets, which identities are being utilized for these kinds of things. And so the more of those different pieces I have, the more visibility I can get into this, right? So as we're walking through this, you're going to kind of see some of these things as we're doing our hunting. But, if I have an email attachment, if I have process executions, I have communication paths, I have Windows authentication, those all help give me those insights, but none of those are actually setting off specific alerts. So unto themselves, a single indication that an email was sent is nice, but it doesn't necessarily tell me anything. But when I start putting these pieces together, it starts helping create that bigger picture that we're looking at. So threat hunting is kind of a loaded term. People are trying to understand where threat hunting sits, where incident response sits. For definition purposes, I kind of like to use this as an example. If I'm threat hunting, I have an idea what I want to do. I have specific tools that I take with me when I go threat hunting. I know what I'm going to be looking for generally. Right? I mean, not exactly, but I know generally what I'm looking for, and I'm kind of setting setting my field that I'm going out into. Incident response is a little bit more of the, I had a really bad night, I woke up and there's toilet paper all over the trees in my front yard, now I got to fix it, right? So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, go ahead and just kind of be thinking about it to contextualize it and compare and contrast. At the end of the day, I'm going to be investigating no matter what I do in these scenarios, and so I can use the same data sets to get information either direction. But when we're talking about threat hunting today, we're really kind of talking about going out, assuming breach, and going and looking for badness. Right? Incident response, if you're familiar with the 161 NIST document, that kind of talks about this evolving process where you're going to detection analysis and go to containment and eradication. Threat hunting could potentially trigger your incident response, right, depending what's found. And that's important to understand as well, that I may take this information, I may feed this back to my threat intel team. I may take this information and it turns into a big problem that we have to go ahead and solve as well. And that's okay. But that's how that's kind of the intersections between the threat hunting and the incident response. I really like this. Tweet. I was looking for something kind of random last spring when I was putting this together last February, and sometimes when you scroll through your Twitter feed, it's amazing what kinds of thoughts that you get that you go, yes, that's what I want. So I grabbed this. The incident responder, right, was infected with crimeware. We had IT rebuild the system. We're good. We moved forward. The nation-state adversary on the other side of that says, oh, we had a foothold and we lost a single host. Right? I may have put 4 or 5 footholds out there, and if I lost a single host, that's still 75%, 80% success. And I've got those other little baddies that are already out there going ahead and establishing that toehold. Right? So when we hunt, this is why we're hunting. We can't be just satisfied that the incident response team got that one thing, we're good. We're going to still keep looking for those other things that are out there that maybe we missed. So hunting occurs both in the past and the present. Right? I want to be able to go back and look historically over time. There might be new pieces of information that I get that require me to go back further and see what else was out there that I wasn't aware of before, as well as looking in the here and now and being able to pivot in all different directions. So when we talk about what do we want to hunt for, there's a number of different things that we can hunt for. This is David Bianco's Pyramid of Pain, for those of you familiar with that. When you start at the low end, the hashes and the IP addresses, they're very easy to search for, right? I can go ahead and put an IP address in and say, tell me where I see this IP address. But it's also very easy for an adversary to change these kinds of values, right? As I work farther and farther up the stack, it's much harder for the adversary to change the way that they carry out their attacks, but it's also a heck of a lot harder for the for you from the hunting perspective to be able to find those TTPs and those tools that they're using, right? So it's kind of a trade-off. It's both directions. It's a little more challenging. This is another good book. If anybody hasn't come across this yet, and take the opportunity to, The Intelligence-Driven Incident Response Outwitting the Adversary by Scott Roberts and Rebecca Brown. This is just a quote I pulled out of the book itself, but to people outside the security team, hunting looks like lucky guessing, but it's far from that. Hunting's based on a combination of instinct, experience, and slide my window over here, and good intelligence, right? So while this sometimes can look easy when you start pulling things together, you really need to sit down and take the tools that you have and be putting these things together and coming up with the answers that you're seeking, right? So where do we start? Well, we could start with that very simple thing and take an indicator and pull on that string, right? We could go ahead and put that IP address in and do that who, what, where, when, why, right? And develop a lead off of that and then pivot off of that lead. And that's totally fine. That's certainly a valid way to start with this. We could do brainstorming, right? Past security events that you have could be used to identify trends, right? Did you go to a HackerCon where somebody was talking about SSL certificates being a technique to identify attacker infrastructure? If you did, maybe you come back and you try that and use that as part of your hunt, right? Is spear phishing a common problem that you have from a delivery perspective, from a adversary perspective? Maybe that's something I would spend some additional time hunting for on an ongoing basis within my environment. Maybe I want to look at outliers and do, anomalies, and so start looking at data volumes, look at directionality of data, look at it last month compared to this month, or last year compared to this year, and looking for those different variances between these different pieces. Or potentially, if you have red teams coming in or adversaries, doing that kind of pen testing, maybe take a look look at the things that they're targeting and finding success with and going, well, you know, if my red team's targeting these things and having success, why couldn't an adversary take advantage of those same things as well? And using some of those. So there's a lot of different things you can use to brainstorm to kind of get started if you're going to go down the hunting path. Now, there's a couple of things we want to do when we start characterizing adversary operations, and we can use something like the Lockheed Martin kill chain. And the Lockheed Martin kill chain allows us to kind of look at this and say, okay, you know, there's every step along the way. If I can go ahead and interdict anywhere along this chain, I could potentially disrupt the attack itself. And I could go ahead and pivot and learn more about the current attacks that are going on and maybe get smarter about future attacks to thwart them, right? And Lockheed Martin was kind of the first ones to do this. MITRE ATT&CK, which is actually where we're going to spend a lot of our focus today in terms of how we contextualize these hunts, builds on top of Lockheed Martin's kill chain, but then focuses on tactics and techniques that happen at exploit and to the right of exploit. So as we refer to the right of bang. So when something happens, that's the exploit, and then there's the different techniques that go along from there. We're going to talk about those pretty extensively. On the left side of bang is what MITRE calls pre-attack, and so this builds on the Lockheed Martin kill chain, but again, it looks at things prior to the exploit. These things are things like, you know, how do I select, how do I do intel gathering, how do I go ahead and build up my personas, and who should I be targeting? These are kind of tough. These are really tough to kind of go back against because you really need to have the stuff to the right first to work back to the left. But if you can get to the point where you're getting these kinds of pieces of intelligence on the front end, you can really make the adversary's life miserable because you're able to go ahead and you know, and have a better understanding as to what they're targeting, what they're looking at, and what they're going after. The last model I was going to talk about briefly is the diamond model. So folks that might be in the threat intel world on the call may have some good familiarity with threat intel and the diamond model. The idea behind this is to contextualize the threat and take the threat intelligence that you're finding during hunting and kind of lay this out. And so the three gentlemen listed there, and there's a link, and which we're happy to get out to you guys about the white paper that they wrote around the diamond model. Three connected an interesting blog around using, looking at Star Wars and using the diamond model as using that for the Battle of Yavin, which for those who follow Star Wars or maybe don't follow Star Wars, right? We're talking about Episode 4, A New Hope, right at the end, the planet before the first Death Star blew up, and looking at this from a victim perspective, the victim, of course, being the Empire, and looking at the relationship between the victim and the adversary, the capabilities and the infrastructure, and how you have these XY axes that have the sociopolitical and the technical axis, okay? And so you can take this and contextualize this from a threat perspective and kind of understand the relationships across these different vertices, okay? We'll talk about this and look a little bit at the diamond model as we're building out our hunt as well, and the different findings that we have in the hunt and how we fill out our threat intel picture to a certain extent there as well. So at the end of the day, what are we trying to accomplish? We want to go ahead and take one of the steps along the way. Any one of these steps, we want to deny, we want to disrupt. Right? If we can deny our adversary access, if we can disrupt our adversary's attack, right, that's a good day. And what we want to do is the more intel we can gather, the more threat hunting that we can do within these spots, we can go ahead and work and improve our security operations so it becomes something more streamlined. Right? This isn't easy. The first search you're going to write is not going to be the perfect search. It never is. Right? You might end up with false positives. Right? What you can do with this is, again, using some of the things that we're talking about here, building, going ahead, leads, and testing on our known good system kind of helps instrument some of the searches, right? So if you have a golden master image, if you will, and you want to go ahead and say, hey, these kinds of things are things that are unique to my environment, those are things that would be false positives, right? That's good to understand and instrument what that would look like so that you're not creating excessive noise when you're doing your hunting. Running things against the sample data set, the example that we have here, where we have an adversary who's using a specific set of techniques and be able to instrument against that is a way that we can do that. Also understanding that, you know, if we run it against a sample data set and then we want to run a big month-long search that runs for a really long time, we don't want to be disappointed when we come back and say, you either got a load of extra data or nothing at all because our search wasn't really written for our environment correctly. So there's testing and refining that's always going to go on with these. And then the last thing I kind of want you all to keep in mind from a level perspective is you want to really try to operationalize your findings. At the end of the day, we want to create this feedback loop from our hunting and into our incident response and our security operations. So as we talk today, we're going to develop hypotheses. And those hypotheses are what we're going to go ahead and then hunt against to validate. And if we successfully validate it, then we found something and we can go from there, right? What I don't want to do is I don't want to do the same hunt over and over and over again. I want to be able to hunt, I want to be able to find something, I want to be able to go ahead and write that up, and I want to figure out how I can operationalize that so the next time I can go hunt for something different. And in the meantime, those things that I found the last time could be things that the SOC alerts on that we can then take action on, and we can either automate those actions, or we can automate that response, or we can just be smarter about how we do things. Right? James Bauer did it was a YouTube video that he's posted called Threat Hunting Web Shells with Splunk, and the quote that he had in there was, end goal of hunting should be a change in policy or procedure, i.e. operationalization. Don't do the same thing over and over again. And that really resonated with me. All right, so let's set the scene here real quick. The organization that we are protecting today that we work for is an organization called Frothly. Frothly itself is a organization based out in San Francisco, quite near the Splunk office. It is a yeast, beer yeast creator and seller of fine, very, very similar kinds of beers out there. So if you've heard of Pliny the Stepchild, that is a beer that we create along with a couple of others. Our organization is led by our founder, Grace Hoppy, the CEO, and these are some of the key players that report integrates that are within the organization. And so each one of these folks has a role within the organization, as you would expect. But unfortunately, all is not well with Frothly. We found that the adversary group, the nation-state adversary group, Taedonggang APT, was targeting Frothly and going after them, presumably to go ahead and steal some of the intellectual property that they have and be able to exfiltrate that back and use that for their own means. Okay, so with that as our background, Alice Bluebird, who is our security consultant, has recently come on board to Frothly. And her role in all of this is obviously to be able to do some hunting along with the data set that we have to go ahead and see if we can go ahead and figure out what the heck's happened. So how are we going to hunt? Well, if we take a look at the 4 vertices to the diamond model, we want to think about where we want to start. You can start from any of the 4 sides of the diamond model, and really what we want to do as we're hunting is we want to start in one of these places, and we want to continually try to get ahead and gain additional answers and insights across the other vertices. Now, the toughest one to really hunt from is an adversary perspective, and quite honestly, we're not really getting into the attribution on our side. So while we want to understand more about our adversary, we're not going to necessarily nail it down to this is the adversary, this is exactly who it is, right? But what I want to focus more on, and generally where people tend to focus, is focusing their hunt starting from a capabilities perspective or the victim perspective, because obviously we know who the victim is, we're the victim. We want to go ahead and figure out where we want to go from there. But we can also start from a capabilities-based hunt. And so those are generally the 2 places that you often start. You don't always have to, but those are the places we would generally be starting from. So we're not going to be covering all of these different hunting hypotheses. We actually built this out with this adversary simulation to have 12 different hypotheses in there. Those are kind of give you a highlight as to what they are, and they might give you a few clues as to maybe where we're going to be looking as we go into some of this hunting today. But again, we map these over to the MITRE ATT&CK model. And some of the keys and some of the things to be thinking about as we're looking at this, and we'll throw some hints out there as we go through, is that generally you want to start broadly with your searches and then narrow it down so that you don't miss events. If you make a search way too specific, you may find that you've kind of narrowed it too far and then you start missing kinds of things. Everything we're doing is based on time series data, okay? So that's something that's going to be continual that you're going to be thinking about. You can search for data under what's called all time, and you'll see this as we go into the searches, but you don't have to search all time. We'll start narrowing this down. We'll probably provide a couple of hints just to narrow the time ranges down so that the searches can move along a little quicker in terms of covering material as well. And before we dive in, hunting against the hypothesis is going to uncover unexpected things. When you hunt, you can find something that may start wanting to take you in a different direction. You may get distracted. You may want to go in a different way. Be careful about those kinds of things. Make sure you take notes. If you find something interesting, you might want to go down one fork in the road, but maybe you just make a note of that and say, I'm going to come back to that later. Maybe that'll be a new hunt. That when I reach the dead end and I run everything all the way to ground here, then I start a new hunt. So just be cognizant of that, because as we create hypotheses, what we want to do is we want to create a hypothesis. We want to run that thing to ground. We want to say, do we confirm it or do we refute it? And then, depending on which way we go, we then go into the next hunt. Okay, but if we leave a hunt too early, we may leave information on the table that we just still haven't realized, and we need to come back and get it. So let's make sure we take our time to do that. And again, we use MITRE ATT&CK. There's over 100 different techniques defined within MITRE ATT&CK. These hunts do not exist in a silo. So while we are using that specific technique as a starting point for our hunt, we're going to run into intersections with other techniques that are going on out there. So as you're going through, what we're going to do is we'll do a hunt, and then we'll kind of come back together and go through some of the slides with the app to kind of say how these pieces fit together. And you'll see little boxes like in the lower right-hand corner that call out a specific technique. I look at those as kind of being junction points. And so as an example here, right, PowerShell is a technique that's going to yield data encoding techniques. Right? Could we just hunt for data encoding? Absolutely. But in this case, we were looking for PowerShell and we found data encoding. So there's kind of an intersection between the two to kind of help build out our bigger threat picture. All right. So hopefully everybody has credentials at this point. If anyone doesn't, please go ahead and hit us up on the chat so we can make sure that we get those to you. Because at this point, we're going to start diving into the systems. Okay. All right. So your instance should look something like this. It's going to be od-bots-es-wit-xx. XX is going to be your 01 to 30, and then you have your own user ID that has been distributed to you, and you can go ahead and log in. So as you guys can go ahead and log in. As you log in, the first screen that you're going to see is going to look something like this. On the left-hand side, there's going to be an icon. It actually looks a little bit different than what the icon is here. I did change when I refreshed. I updated the app on late last week, and the image changed slightly. But it says something like Hunting APTs Workshop. And if you're logged in and you can go ahead and see that, go ahead and click on that. And once you do that, you'll get a screen that looks something like this. So this is an app inside of Splunk that we built as kind of a helper app to go along with this. This kind of gives you the ability to, then we'll kind of trace through this. Up in the top, you can see overview and then introduction, which is what you're seeing here. And this just kind of provides a high-level explanation as to what the specific app is, kind of give you a little bit of background there. These boxes will be up till tomorrow. So if you want to go back and take a look at it later this evening or tomorrow morning, you're more than welcome to as well. One of the first questions that we might want to ask is, what kind of data do we have? So the Splunk search that's there at the top, that type metadata, type equals source types, index equals bots v2, would go ahead and yield output that's kind of like what's there below. And this is kind of, if I'm starting off and I'm trying to understand what kind of data sets I have, this gives me an idea as to the different data sets I have. I did a little bit of extra stuff with the eval command to kind of do some formatting around time, but the idea behind this is it allows me to very easily kind of see what I have within that metadata command and seeing what kind of data sets I have out there. So the key source types that we're going to be talking about and looking at, I laid out here just as kind of a starting point. There's a set of source types called stream, and then there's based on a protocol. Okay, these are wire data, that we've basically sniffed off the wire and collected as protocol information. So we have information going from like client to a web server, HTTP traffic, and looking at some of those pieces of information, FTP in the same manner. We have Suricata data from an IDS perspective. We have the Palo Alto Network's PAN threat and PAN traffic source types. We have what's called win event as a source type that includes the application, the audit logs from win event log. And then we have one that's a little bit of a mouthful in terms of the typing. So this is the sysmon data, the XML win event log, et cetera, and then win registry. There's a bunch more source types, but those are kind of some of the key ones that we're going to be leveraging. Now, another thing that we're going to leverage is what's called the asset center and the identity center. So this is part of ES, enterprise security. The idea behind assets and identity is it helps provide contextual information when you're hunting. So we're not going to necessarily need this information every single time, but it does matter, right? Because if I'm trying to go ahead and contextualize the hunt, understanding that this system is a Linux system versus a Windows system versus a cloud system versus on-premise, right? Those are important pieces of information that help me understand a little bit more about what I'm hunting for and hunting with. Okay. So where can we see assets and identities? Well, if you go to the top of the screen where it says Splunk Enterprise, it's going to be top left corner of the screen. Next to that it says app : and should be like hunting APTs workshop. Click on that drop down and then click on enterprise security. Hopefully what you should see is the enterprise security app. It'll have a navigation bar that looks kind of like this. So home's on the far left side, and about halfway across, depending on your resolution, you'll see something that says security domains. If you click on security domains, underneath that you'll see four items: access, endpoint, network, and identity. Click on identity, and then click on asset center. Inside of the asset center, you see something that looks kind of like this. So it's populated with assets by priority business unit category, and then down below is asset information. So this is a way that I can go ahead and change the values up at the top and then click the submit button to be able to get information and contextual information around my assets. So looking at this, you can see that I've got a couple of workstations that have IP addresses in the 10.0.2 range. Right, I can see who the owners are. I can see that these are a couple Windows workstations, whereas the 10.0.1.200 is a Linux system, and so forth. And so you can certainly come back to the Asset Center as you're looking at things to contextualize information a little bit further. You don't have to go into the Identity Center, but you can certainly do that. Basically, you're in that same menu structure, but you pick Identity Center instead. And the Identity Center has a similar capability where I go ahead and put in my username, my business unit, what have you, and then I have my information below. Now, we don't have a ton of users in here. We don't have a ton of assets in here to keep it straightforward and make it easier to find these things. But the idea here is that I can scale this out into the hundreds or thousands of assets and identities that I have within my environment and be able to quickly search and be able to see the context here. Another thing that you can use to generate context is glass tables. So if you go across that nav bar at the top and move across to the glass tables, go ahead and click on that. And then inside the glass tables, let's go ahead and click on Frothly Environment, and the one that's in red. And inside of that, what you'll see is something that looks like this. This is just a map that we went ahead and drew from a network architecture perspective of our environment. So again, oftentimes when I'm hunting, I want to understand where these different systems sit within the environment. In this case, we have a set of systems that are in a cloud environment, specifically AWS. We can see that our O365 is also up in the cloud, and then we can see behind the firewall, which has specific interfaces associated with it, what does our on-premise environment look like as well. So again, when I'm hunting and I start looking at things and I start seeing data flowing from one device to another, it's important that I understand where my workstation enclave is, where my server enclave is, where my cloud enclave is, right? Where my service provider enclave is, right? So understanding where those different pieces are helps generate that context, because I might see an IP address and I go, I'm not even sure what that log is or that event is. If I can pull those network maps and be able to quickly see that, oh, that's this firewall or this connection to a partner that helps provide that additional context that I'm looking for. So a couple of SPL commands that we're going to go ahead and use, and this is not exhaustive by any stretch, but these are a couple of handy ones to just be aware of. The stats command within Splunk, the sort command, which does kind of what you expect it to do, a time chart, which allows us to go ahead and overlay statistical values over time and lay that out in a graphical format, eval, which allows us to do some data manipulation post-search, the table command, which puts stuff literally into a table, right into a tabular view, and then reverse, which kind of works basically taking a result set and put it on its head, and just reverse it literally. You can't see me moving my hands as I'm flipping them back and forth. All right, so let's go back up to the top. This is our basic navigation. We'll go back up to the app and select Hunting APTs Workshop. And then when we open up the APT app, there is the drop down that says Hunting Scenarios. Go ahead and click on the Hunting Scenarios app, or the top level navigation, and you'll see all the different hunts that we've got here. Okay? What we're going to go ahead and do is going to go ahead and click on Schedule Tasks. You see Schedule Tasks about halfway down the list, and then click on the expansion next to that, and let's go ahead and start with clicking on Hypothesis. And now we're about ready to dive on in here. Just a quick check, since I know I kind of rattled through a lot of that. If anybody is not there or what have you, no problem. Just go ahead and hit us up in the chat window so we can make sure that we get you there. Okay. All right. So, as I mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and use attack and the MITRE ATT&CK techniques as the way to kind of start off our hunt. And you don't have to do that, but that's what we're using to kind of get things started here. So if I go ahead and look at MITRE ATT&CK, schedule task is a specific technique. Notice on the right-hand side is some of the information that they've gone ahead and used to define the technique itself, but the hypothesis we're going to work under is at the top left of the screen. An adversary will look to maintain persistence across reboots by using a task scheduler. Pretty straightforward. The description below is MITRE's, and there's a link there to MITRE specifically, but what we want to go ahead and do is say, well, you know, if somebody goes ahead and gets hold of this system, if I can go ahead and set up a task schedule that, you know, once a day it spins up a process or what have you that I can control, then I can go ahead and make sure that I hold on to access. So even if whatever I put out the system is maybe memory resident and a reboot would clear that out, this gives me a way to go ahead and keep things moving that I can get back onto that system. Maybe I set it to run every day, every hour, whatever that is, right? But I can go ahead and set up that task schedule. So let's think about this, and this is on your main screen there. You can scroll down and take a look. But you know, what are some questions that maybe as we're starting to hunt through this, we want to ask that can either confirm or refute our hypothesis, right? So one of the first things I always want to do is I want to think about what are the data sources I have that can identify scheduled tasks. Okay, because really, if I can go ahead and start honing in on the specific data sets, that's going to be very important. Are there specific event codes or values that could indicate scheduled task execution? Okay, something else to kind of think about. And some of these questions are things that I'm going to have to go, man, I have to go outside of my tool right here because I don't necessarily know all these things. But there's a wonderful thing called Google and the internet that I can pivot on out to ask questions like these. Right, so if I don't know my specific event codes, not a problem. I just got to go out and find that information, then I come back and apply it here, right? Some of the other things, are there key values that are scheduled task queues when they're created or modified? And then, of course, I want to start figuring out if I do find scheduled tasks, who created them? What systems were used to create them? What scheduled tasks were performed? What are the names of the scheduled tasks? Again, with an eye towards operationalization, what are some things I should be looking for down the road as well? Okay. So this is kind of where I stop for a moment and give you guys a little bit of time to go ahead and start hunting scheduled tasks. Now, a couple other things, because we're doing this kind of in a compressed time frame, one of the other things that I want to call out is to kind of help guide and narrow down your hunt. The hunting time frame that we're doing this in is roughly, we'll say August 22, 8/22, 2006 2017, okay, to August 29th, 2017. So we're going to take that week as kind of being our window of time, okay? Obviously, if you're doing this in your real life environment, you wouldn't necessarily have that luxury, although you might have some alerts that came in that would provide indications as to where to start your hunt. So for our intents and purposes, we'll say 8/22/2017 to 8/29/2017. And let's throw that in the chat as well so that everybody has that to reference back to. Okay. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give everybody, let's say, 10 or 15 minutes here, give or take. We'll kind of check back in and let you go ahead and start doing some hunting. If people have questions as we're going through this, there is a Slack room as well as the WebEx chat, and Ryan and myself will be there, happy to answer questions. The app exists out there as a tool that you can go ahead and use to reference things. There are steps, the answers are there, so the answer key is on the next couple of screens after the one that you guys are on. So if there's something that you want to go and take a look at, that you're like, hey, I got this far, but I think there's something else I need to look at, you're certainly more than welcome to look at those screens. We'll talk about those and talk about our process after we get we bring everybody back together, but I want to give people a chance to go ahead and hunt themselves first. If you want to go ahead and take a look at those screens, you're more than welcome to. If you want to go ahead and take a look at one of them and pivot off of it and keep playing around with it a little bit more as well, not a problem. However you guys want to go about that. We're going to be here. We'll go ahead and, like I said, take the next 10 or 15 minutes to kind of start going through this, and then we'll kind of come back together and walk through it step by step. Okay?
Okay.
Yes. let's go ahead and give everybody about 5 more minutes, and then we'll come back together and kind of walk through this as a group, okay? All right. I think at this point I'm gonna kind of pull everybody back together here, and we're gonna go ahead and dive in and kind of walk through this. Having done this a couple of different times for a couple of different groups, I always realize that the first hunt is always it's the toughest in the sense that you're walking into a data set pretty much blind. You haven't seen the data set before. You're trying to get acclimated to it and everything else, and so if you didn't get as far as you were hoping to, don't be discouraged by that. That's just unfortunately how this works. one of the advantages of obviously having the data set that you work with in your own environment is you get a lot more comfortable with the different data sets and the source types and everything else that you have within your own organization on a regular basis. So in some ways, taking some of the concepts we're talking about and applying it directly to your environment is actually going to be a heck of a lot easier for you, because you don't have to spend the time to kind of say, well, okay, I've never seen stream data before. What's that? Or I'm not familiar with, how you guys are collecting your data. You know those things already. You know what data sets you have. You also importantly know what data sets you don't have. So, so that gets a little bit easier. So hopefully everybody made some progress through this. What I want to do now is I want to go through and kind of walk through this hunt itself. I'm going to bring it up on slides that you guys are going to see here in front of you. If you're following along in the WebEx, if you're just following along within the app itself, that's fine too. The goal with the app is designed to be kind of a training tool that goes along. So as I'm talking about things on the slides, you're able to kind of scroll along through the app itself and see some of the search syntax, some commentary that goes along with it, some of the actual results. Now, the one tricky part is because I've got one screen that's sharing out via WebEx, I don't have my speaker note prompts that say, hey, you need to click next to go to the next web page. So just kind of bear with me as we go through it. I'll try to go ahead and call those out based on memory, but sometimes my memory isn't as good as it should be. All right. So let's start off by kind of talking about the fundamental question around what is task scheduler itself, right? If I'm not familiar with what task scheduler is, I'm not going to have a lot of success hunting for it unless I learn a little bit about exactly what it is. So I can go out, this is actually pulled straight from Microsoft's site. I can go ahead and see scheduled tasks, tasks.exe. I can see the syntax that goes along into creating a search, a task scheduler. I can also see what it would take to go ahead and change it syntactically. So those are some good pieces of information to kind of understand if I'm looking for this kind of command being issued within my environment, what would some of those syntax pieces and switches be that I need to be looking for. Okay. So this is something that pulls directly out of our data set itself. This is actually an innocuous scheduled task. But what would a scheduled task kind of look like? Well, if I go ahead and take the premise of what was there in the previous screen and maybe just run a generic search, I could start seeing things like this. And so this is something where we're using the sysmon data, the XML win event log Microsoft Windows sysmon operational source type, right? It's the sysmon data. And I can see that I have process creations being the event itself. I can see the scheduled task at the command line with the /change, the /tn switch, the /enable, right? And so you can see down at the bottom of the screen where scheduled tasks using that prior slide commentary sees that I can see I'm changing an existing task, the name of the task itself, and then we're actually enabling it, right? So again, I can go ahead and put those pieces together to kind of understand what I'm working with. So if we pivot into Splunk itself, I could go ahead and write a basic run-of-the-mill search here. And my search that I'm asking for is basically broken up into, tell me what index to search in. So index equals botsv2, that's the data set that the data resides in. Looking for a specific source type, which is that sysmon source type. And then I want to go ahead and look inside of that command line file, that command line field, because in the command line field, as we saw before, that's where we saw, looking at that example one that I had, that's where I would see that scheduled task.exe. And I've also narrowed this down because in this case, I actually know that there's a couple of suspect systems out there that I'm most interested in. In your hunt, you might start broadly, but at the same time, your hunt might also be bounded as you're building your hypothesis to say, I'm going to look at my database servers, or I'm going to go ahead and look at my web servers, or I'm going to look at this set of workstations in this field office, right? So even though I have 4 systems there spelled out, that's not to say that you would start broad and say, search my entire enterprise. Your hypothesis might actually say, I'm going to look at the Des Moines field office. And if I'm going to look at the Des Moines field office, I'm going to go ahead and use my IP ranges for that specific area to bound my search. So that's totally valid. Okay, and then at that point, all I'm doing is I specify my time range, and I kind of shortened it up here just to tighten it up for screen view. But within that time range of that 822 to 829 time range, and then I use the table command to go ahead and generate a tabular output of my data. And so I can see the time of the event, the host of the event,
thank you,
the command line, and then the parent command line. Those are the 4 values that I just decided to go ahead and output here. And I can start seeing the different pieces of scheduled task. So from there, I can go ahead and kind of continue to refine this, and maybe I want to go ahead and understand what are the names of the tasks that are running. Okay, and so in this case, what I'm using is I'm actually using what's called the rex command, and this is regular expressions. Okay, so folks versed in regular expressions, this will come very straightforward. For folks that aren't as versed in regular expressions, I sympathize because I feel like I'm in your shoes. But again, there's good references out there. There's good help sheets that kind of help go ahead and help build regular expressions, and some of it's a little bit of trial and error. And so what we did here was we just added to our search the rex command, where we're basically saying, let's look inside that command line because that's where that value would be, right? The name of that update, the name of that value would be in there. And we're basically saying, look for the TN, right? Whether it's capital or lowercase TN combination. And then we're going to basically take the value that exists after that, and we're going to call that the task name. And then we would basically add another column to our table called the task name. So we can see that we have some Microsoft Office updaters in there, and then we see a set of tasks called updater as well. Okay, so now I'm able to go ahead and kind of get a feel for what are the tasks that are out there in the host that they're on. Now that we've got some of this information, we want to probably start looking at these command lines that are actually happening out there. And if you go back to the references, and I pulled those references out here to the top, you can see that we have these creation events, right? The /f switch is if I'm going to go back to Microsoft, says forcefully creates the task and suppresses warnings. That might be something your admin might choose to do, but I'd say an adversary probably doesn't want to have a pop-up that says, is it okay to run this? Right? So that might be something I'd be looking for. I can see that it wants to specify the user runs in the system context. You know, if I want to have something that's running over and over and persistent, system context would be a good place to go. If I want to set up a schedule, right, the frequency, the time, right, obviously a name and then a path, those are different things that I want to look at. So I can start looking inside of my command line and start pulling these little attributes out of the command line itself. And what I see as I get down to that /tr switch is I start seeing some PowerShell. And I see some PowerShell with some hidden flags, a window hidden flag. And I can go ahead and see that I've got some base 64 encoding and some calls into some registry, which, again, probably aren't things I would necessarily expect to see by my normal admins that are going ahead and doing any PowerShell work, right? That might be something suspicious that I want to go ahead and flag on. So, sorry, really quick, going back down here, as I start looking at these pieces of information here down below, I see the get string convert from base 64 string GP, and then I see NKLM. Whenever I see stuff like NKLM, or I start seeing these hierarchies, software, Microsoft network, right? Hopefully that's where people kind of start looking and going, yeah, that kind of sounds like, that kind of sounds like registry, right? HK local machine, right? Those are kind of those hints that I sit there and go, wow, that sounds like registry information. And if I have registry information, because I'm maybe logging down to the changes and things that are happening on my registry settings, I could go ahead and pivot down into that and start looking, at the Windows registry. And so I could go ahead and have a subsequent search here that allows me to go ahead and start looking at this and saying, let's go ahead and, again, look at my specific index, my boss v2 index. I'm going to look for a source type of Win registry, right, the Windows registry settings. And then what I can start doing is I can then start doing some string matching and basically just looking for things like software Microsoft network. Well, if I do those individually, it can get a little bit broad, but as I start kind of putting those pieces together, and one important note is, with the escape characters, right, you need 2 slashes instead of 1, because otherwise the system will, if you put a single slash, it thinks it's escaping something, right? So you put 2, one's the escape character, one's the actual slash. I can go ahead and start searching for the Win registry and look for that structure, right, that software Microsoft network structure, and I can go ahead and see that I have 4 different events inside of my Windows registry settings that have been modified, right? And I can start taking a look and seeing what's inside of those as well. And if you start looking at these, you'll see they all have set values, and you can see that the process image for each one of these is PowerShell, okay? If I then go ahead and expand, right, because you can see that there's a button that says show all lines, show all 8 lines in this case, and you can see the one that I have that's compressed at the top of the screen, and then down below I have one that's expanded. I can see that inside of that key path, I have a data object, right? And the data object under software, Microsoft Network Debug, is this data blob. Well, we had a hint back earlier that said base 64 for a value, but we also have a data blob that looks like something that I wouldn't necessarily expect to see in my registry setting. So what could I do with this? Well, I could go ahead and take this. I could go out to something like a CyberChef or base 64 decoder. Choose your favorite one that's out there. That's one we use quite frequently, and that works quite well. That's something that there is a website out there called CyberChef. You can also download it from GitHub and install it locally for yourself as well, or you can use some other tool. But when I go ahead and decode that, I start getting something that looks like this. Now, my reference to back to PowerShell Empire Cradle is that we actually had some other hunts go on as well that would allude to some of these things. But the point being is that I start getting a somewhat obfuscated string here that kind of lends itself to start looking at and understanding a little bit more about what's being fed through here. So the question that we need to come back to at the end of every hunt. Right, were we able to confirm our hypothesis? And this is actually starting on the findings page, so if you're following along and I managed to lose you along the way, I apologize. We're going to go, you're going to go into the findings page. And inside the findings page, the question we're going to ask is, were you able to confirm this? Well, we did see scheduled tasks that were being run, right? We saw 3 of them running. And, this certainly looks like via a PowerShell command that somebody was executing yes, we were certainly seeing this happen. So what have we learned? Because again, every hunt that we have, we want to make sure we walk away and that we learn something. Well, we're seeing that task scheduler was being used to maintain persistence. We saw encoded PowerShell being used to create tasks. Those tasks have identical names, right? They're all called updater. All 3 systems that had this had updater, right? The tasks were identical. If I start looking at those command lines, every single thing about them were identical except the start time, okay? The tasks were designed to call that PowerShell cradle that was written out in the registry, right? The 4 systems that have this value in the registry would seem to indicate that all 4 of them were compromised, okay? But what was weird about it was we had 4 registry settings, but we only had 3 task schedulers. So something's wrong with that 4th one, right? Does that mean we can ignore the 4th one? No, but it helps us kind of identify that, hey, maybe these 3 are in this class of problem, and this other one is in this other class, but it's still in a problematic state. But it allows me to go ahead and maybe prioritize where I need to be responding as well, right? And then the encoding in the registry and the task obviously are intended to obfuscate intent, right? If you don't necessarily have the WIN registry data and the sysmon data, you may not be able to get down to that level of granularity. By having that kind of nested in there, it makes it a little bit harder to find and to ferret out. You could go ahead and maybe make an assumption, but you don't necessarily have that proof without having turned on some of those other pieces of the logging. But again, I want to be able to go ahead and say, what have I learned from my hunt? So another thing I like to do is I like to draw pictures. I'm not a good artist, but I like to go ahead and make notes about different things I find. And since I'm not having to write this down longhand, it makes it easier for me to cut and paste these out. So I can say, hey, here are the 3 systems that all have the task scheduler, scheduled tasks run. Here are the command strings that ran on each one of them. I can look at them side by side and say, yep, the only thing that changed is the time to start. I can look at the underlying parent commands, and the parent commands are a little bit different, right? A little bit different command strings, but they generally are kind of doing the same things, because when I go ahead and I look at the underlying encoded PowerShell, I can see that all 3 have the same user agent string. And I can go ahead and look at it and say there's a different session cookie for one of the machines, that WRKBton, compared to the others, but they both have the same URLs that would be the C2, and they both have the same URIs. So there's a lot of commonality between these, and I can probably sit there and say, hey, there's probably a linkage between these 3 systems, okay? This is kind of the thing. So I kind of looked at it, I focused on this. We only pulled up one of those examples in the slide as we're going through, but what I want to be doing is being able to put these side by side and kind of compare and contrast as we go. All right, so if I wanted to go ahead and take this and say, what have I learned from this? And I want to kind of put this from a diamond model perspective and from an adversary perspective. Obviously the victim itself is Frothley, right? We're the innovative brewer and home brewing company. And what I know now from this hunt is that my adversary has capabilities associated with PowerShell that they're using to take advantage of. And I also know that from a capability and infrastructure access, from a technical access, that scheduled task.exe was being used for maintaining persistence across the reboot. Okay? So those are some things that I've learned from this from a hunt perspective. I want to go ahead and make sure I tackle those and then identify those. As we look at our techniques as a whole, we obviously started our hunt with our hypothesis of scheduled tasks. But what other techniques did we uncover during this? Well, we uncovered PowerShell. PowerShell is obviously its own technique, and data encoding is also a technique. Now, if I'm looking at an adversary tool set, like I said, I might have multiple techniques lumped on top of each other, right? But each of those techniques are separate unto themselves. But I can take these pieces and start putting them together and start saying, well, this adversary is using a combination of techniques, so that maybe when I start looking, I start saying, well, I've seen this guy using PowerShell and data encoding, but they never use scheduled tasks for persistence. They use some other technique. Well, maybe I'm going to classify them as one adversary, and then there's another adversary that's using PowerShell, data encoding, and scheduled tasks. Maybe that's a separate adversary, and I can start kind of looking at these pieces in a more macro environment and kind of saying, well, this is one adversary over here because they're doing this combination of things in their attack plan versus somebody else in their attack actions as well. So how can we operationalize this, right? So this one's actually kind of a tough one to operationalize because it really depends upon how your organization does task schedulers, right? Task schedulers, if you use those all the time and everything else, it's going to probably blend in a bit. But you could certainly look for task schedulers that deviate from your IT baseline, right? Now, the IT guys have to be able to help you out here and be able to provide, a good feel for what exactly they do from a standardization perspective. But, if I can go ahead and understand what the standard IT scheduled tasks are, that's probably a good place to start. If you have users that are building their own scheduled tasks, obviously that can be a little bit tricky. But, whitelists and those kinds of things can come into play. You could go ahead and look for task names that don't match the IT standard. You could look for scheduled tasks that are running under unexpected users, right? Should tasks run as a system? Should tasks run as a named user, right? Those kinds of questions are good questions to ask because then you can start looking for those as outlier analysis as well. Should the scheduled task have command strings that are outside of normal, right? Should my PowerShell scripts be running as scheduled tasks? Some organizations, yeah, they might. Some organizations, no, they won't. You need to understand that from an organizational perspective and then start looking for some of these things in that manner. All right. So we're going to kind of put that hunt down. We're going to transition into a new hunt. That one is going to be more around account persistence. So at this point, we're going to go back up to the top of the screen. We're going to go up to the hunt. We're going to go to account persistence. And then there's the navigation button, navigation arrow to the right, and go ahead and click on the hypothesis screen. We'll go ahead and load that up and then start talking about this one. Okay. I'll assume everybody's there. If you're not or you're having problems with the system loading, go ahead and hit us up on chat. But from our hypothesis at this point, our hypothesis for this is within attack, there is actually a technique called create account. Information's there on the right-hand side. Our hypothesis that we've created is the adversary will look to maintain persistence across an enterprise by creating user accounts. Okay. The description below is pulled directly from MITRE. The technique link is there as well for reference. Okay. So we're looking for account creations for persistence. So what are some of the things that we might do to confirm or refute our hypothesis, right? And again, in this case, we're kind of in confirm mode, but you get the idea. So again, I want to look at what data sources could I be using to identify the user account creation, right? What are the specific event codes or values that would indicate user account creation, okay? What are some of the commonalities to look for if multiple user accounts are created? And then also, what are the differences, right? When might those user accounts have been created? Obviously, who created those? Who initiated the creation of those? What groups were they added to, right? And what systems initiated account creation? And again, as you're thinking about this, you can kind of start seeing where we're going to go with the operationalization part of this on the back end, right? But again, I start with my data sets. I start with my event codes. Let's figure out what that population looks like, and then let's start moving it farther and farther down and getting more granular with that. Okay? So, with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and hunt for account persistence. So we're going to go ahead and let's go ahead and take 15 minutes. And let's go ahead and go through this. If there's any questions, Slack is there, chat is there. Go ahead and hit us up. The web app is there as well. So if you need to go ahead and peek ahead, you're more than welcome to. But if you want to go ahead and ask any questions, by all means. And again, Google is always your friend when you're looking for things like event codes if you're not familiar with those event codes right off the top of your head. All right, go to it. All right, and I apologize. I had left myself on mute as I started talking for those first two slides, so I hope you guys enjoyed them. All right. What I was saying was Google for Google for Windows account creation 4720. I sounded a lot pithier the first time. And then go ahead and search based on the source type and the event code for 4720. The big point I guess I would call out here is that while I only have 4 events in this case, you're going to have more for an enterprise, but at the same time, the concept of being able to say, okay, we're starting with 4720s, we're going to see those Windows event login account creations. That's okay. We can still kind of use this as a starting spot, and then we're going to dig in based on the other things that we're going to be working with. So inside of the event log itself, there's 4 sections, right? There's a subject, a new account, an attributes, and additional information. And so again, if I'm referencing back to my documents, I can see that the account name is the name of the account that requested the create user operation. And then the SAM account name is actually going to be the login name of the account used to support the clients and servers from previous editions, and then it's the attribute of new user object. So for the local account, this field is going to contain the name of the new user account. So when I create a new user account, that's the name of that user account, right? The account type is going to be the person who was logged into the system who actually initiated that creation. Important because obviously in Windows event log, there's obviously a lot of different pieces of information there, and knowing which one is which is very, very important. So again, the reference to the logs, reference to information is very, very good. So what does it look like? I put this in 2 columns just to make it a little more readable. On the left-hand side, there's the subject, the security ID of service promptly 3. Service 3 was the account name. The new account itself is called SVCVNC. And then on the right-hand side, I have a bunch of attributes. Well, a lot of those attributes are the value not set, value not set, value not set. Looks pretty plain and kind of boring out there, but that's what it looks like. Now, one of the things we don't really talk about, but I kind of made an assumption you guys know about, is being able to take a search and then on the left-hand side of the screen, be able to drill into additional information. So those interesting fields on the left-hand side, you can click on any one of those and they'll go ahead and give you a little pop-out of detailed information around each of those fields. So that's something we do with Splunk. We extract those values at search time. But if I clicked on the SAM account name, you'll see that SVCVNC is the same value in all 4 of those creation accounts. If I click on account name actually shows, because the way it kind of comes across, because it's the same field name multiple times, it's going to pull that SVCVNC because it's showing up under a field called account name and doesn't really break out the different hierarchies within the Windows event log, but it also says service 3 is seen 3 times and billy.ton is seen once. Well, if I know my SAM account name based on my previous screen there is the name of the new account being created, I can see that SVCVNC was created 4 times. And if I look at the account name, knowing that the account name was the thing that initiated that, even if I, even with that kind of oddness that Windows event fields kind of have with the same field names, I can see that service 3 was referenced 3 times and billy.ton was referenced 1 time. So those are probably some of the names of accounts and users that I need to be focusing on. So I can go back to my search itself. I can kind of refine this a little bit more and say, let's go ahead and do that same search, but now let's just return the values for SVCVNC, right? And let's go ahead and table this output. So let's make it more of a little bit more readable fashion. So again, tabling it out, let's put a time when it was created. Let's go ahead and put the host it was created on. Let's go ahead and pull the account name and the SAM account name, and we get something that looks like this, okay? And so we can see 4 specific hosts that this SVCVNC was created on, and we can see the names of the account names that created that. And then what we can also start doing is we can start looking at these systems, and maybe we want to start looking at the account attributes. And again, this kind of goes back into some of the operationalization and maybe some of the things that maybe look a little bit different about a normal account being created within your environment versus an anomalous account. So in this case, what we did was we took our exact same search, but what we did was we added a number of additional columns to this, okay? Those additional columns would be those additional values. So things like the home directory, the home drive, the user principal name, the display name, the path profile. Think about this from your own environment. When you guys provision a new user, or when your IT staff provisions a new user, what are those fields that are populated? Most places probably don't do every single one of those, but a lot of places have home drives. A lot of people have a specific principal name that you want to put in there for a specific user, right? You have password expiration, account expirations that expire after 30, 60, 90 days, whatever those kinds of things are. Maybe you use login hours, right? Those things are usually set. But in this case, what I'm doing is basically saying, show me all of those, and then I'm using what's called the transpose command. So the transpose command basically takes whatever my output is and transposes it. It moves the columns to the rows, okay, and the rows to the columns. So what I end up with here is I end up with a column of attributes on the left-hand side, and then each of the columns next to it are the 4 individual accounts that we were just looking at. And as we look across these attributes, we can see that these attributes are identical all the way across, with the exception of the logon hours, where 3 of them say all and 1 say value not set. And the 4th row, where the account name is billy.ton versus the other ones, which are service 3. So we see a lot of commonalities here. The commonalities are the fact that they're all kind of pretty blank as well. But it gives me some ideas as to say, well, these are all kind of being provisioned in the same manner. So what else could I look for? Well, I could go ahead and refine this a little bit more, and so this kind of gets into some of the eval commands, and we use the rex command, and this does a little bit more heavy lifting. But we're looking at like multi-value fields. So the MV index allows us to go ahead and search multi-value fields. And what it's looking for in that first one is it's looking for the current account. The current account is the first one that's listed. And then in the second one, it's looking for what was the account modified, which is basically that second time the security ID is seen. Because when we count multi-value fields, we count 0 is the first one instance, 1 is the second instance, 2 is the third instance, and so forth. But what we're doing is we're basically saying, okay, the first value in the Windows event field is the current account. The second time you see security ID is the account modified, right? We did a rex to extract the message, right? Because the message I'm looking for, and part of this was also to make it a little bit easier to see here. So I did that as well. And then we outputted a number of these different fields. And we did this basically roughly around the same time that those 4720 events happened. And there was a question on the Slack channel about this. And it's a great question. The 4720 itself is really just creating the account, okay? But if you start looking at all of these other ones that we have listed here, we have a 4724, which was an attempt that was made to reset an account password, and 4738 where a user account was changed, and 4722 where a user account was enabled, right? If you look at those all happened at the exact same time that first 4720 was actually created. So you can also start looking and saying, okay, these are other kinds of event code that I expect to see happening roughly around the same time. And then I can start looking at those other codes to get some of those additional pieces of information. As you start looking down a little bit farther there, you see 8 seconds after that other account, you see a 4732 where a member was added to a security-enabled local group. And you can see, looking at that list of security IDs, the administrator local group was added to that user. And so what I can see over this is I can start seeing, yeah, the account was 4720, but then there's all these other ancillary event codes that tell me more about it and help paint the picture a little bit more and kind of color in those edges. Now, another thing I might want to do as I'm starting to look at account persistence and account creation is start looking for explicit credential events. And explicit credential events are 4648 events. And so really all I did here was change my search just a little bit to go ahead and change our event code from 4620 to 4648. I'm still looking for kind of the same kinds of pieces of information, but what I can see here is that while the account billy.ton was logged in, that login of a credential of service 3 looks like it was attempting to log into a number of different workstations and servers across my environment. So that seems a little bit odd for a couple of reasons. Why would I have a user logged in with a service account being used to go ahead and hit a number of different boxes? Maybe that's totally fine in a specific organization, but that might be something that I want to look at and say that's somewhat anomalous, and that would be something else I'd want to go ahead and dig into as well. So some of those kinds of things can be done as well. So again, going back to our findings, let's go back to the findings screen if you're not there. Were we able to go ahead and confirm our hypothesis? I say yes, we were able to go ahead and see that an account was being created on multiple systems. If I was digging into this, I probably wouldn't be connecting these dots to those other pieces to say it was being maintained in persistence. Maybe I don't necessarily have all of that in just the microcosm that we just looked at, but the fact that we are seeing this 4720 event in multiple spots, that we're seeing, again, the same attributes being put onto each one of them. In this case, they're a little bit thin, but the same attributes that are being applied there, that would be things that might help lend to say, yes, we've got this happening. Again, what have we learned, right? We want to learn something from our hunt. Well, I might go back to that asset information and look at the attributes and say user account SVC VNC was created on 4 systems. Those 4 systems that we have, if I look at the asset context, 2 of them were servers, 2 of them were workstations. So let's enumerate which ones those were. If I look at the account creation, they all happened within a 40-minute time window on August 23rd. That's a piece of information I want to go ahead and gather up as well. Each one of them had a very, very small number of attributes associated with that. That's also a good piece of information to know because maybe that's not my corporate standard. 3 accounts were created by Service 3. The first one, though, was created by Billy.Ton. If I'm looking at my time series data, then I'm also kind of going, well, that's interesting. This first one had this happen, and then the other 3 had something else happen. Maybe there's a reason that there was a sequence of the one happening with one username and the other one's happening with a different username initiating the change. That might be significant, and that might give me something else to start looking for. The other thing that we have here as well, and then this is also a way to go ahead and use your hunts to establish maybe what isn't happening And for those following stuff on the blogs, there was an interesting back and forth over Thanksgiving from Robert Lee and Richard Beckley about the role of the hunt and should the individuals hunting also be using this as gap analysis around the logs that are missing. And I don't know, I kind of lean towards the side of using this to help identify gaps is always a valuable thing. Obviously, you don't want that to be your sole focus, but that's a good exercise to sit there and say, you know what, we're seeing Billy, and Billy we know to be a typical user because we looked at our contextual information around Billy. Billy's a regular kind of user. Why on earth would he be going ahead and creating 4720 events if he's a regular kind of user? So then I kind of start thinking from that perspective and say, well, he was creating users. There's some sort of level of rights escalation that went on. So then I start thinking, well, are we missing logs? Or was there something that's more memory-based that didn't have any logs to view? But is there a gap here in my analysis because I don't have all of the logs that I need or all the information that I need? So those are kinds of things that I want to look at and be thinking about, as well as, okay, here's what I found. But what was I not able to find, and why was that? Was that due to a gap in our logging? Was that due to a gap in the way our policies are set up? What is that gap, and then what can we do to close it? So again, from a mapping perspective of drawing my picture, this is what my picture would look like. I've got the 4 service accounts. I've got the IP address, the host name associated with that, and the account names that initiated the new accounts to be created. From my diamond model perspective, I really don't have an additional capability here. I really don't have additional infrastructure to add to this. But from the technical access, we're seeing that the SVC VNC was used to establish account persistence across the environment. So we're going to go ahead and tag that to the technical access. And again, from a MITRE perspective, this is an example where we just had one thing. It was a created account technique. I don't necessarily have additional things I've uncovered in this hunt that would tie back to some of the PowerShell findings I had. It's just not what my hunt did specifically, but it gives me still some good information and allows me to say, yep, I've looked at this from a technique perspective, and this is what I have. So from an operationalization perspective, what can we do? We talked about a number of things already. The 4720 creation events is a good place to start, but then really what I want to do is I kind of want to riff off of that and kind of go a little bit deeper. In your environment, when user accounts are created, do they happen during specific time frames? Even if they don't function in specific time frames, are there time frames that you expect to see them? Maybe it's not policy, but you know what? You know your sysadmin works 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, right? But are you seeing them Saturdays? Are you seeing them off hours, right? Understanding how your sysadmins go ahead and provision user accounts can be helpful to go ahead and start looking for this for outliers. The account attributes, we talked about this, right? They don't all have to be populated, but maybe you populate 2 or 3 of them. Maybe those 2 or 3 are the ones that are always populated, and that's the norm. So maybe we look for the ones that don't have those account attributes populated, right? And start looking for those kinds of patterns, right? If I don't have that pattern that I'm expecting, maybe that's a red flag, maybe that's an alert, maybe that's something we need to take a look at from the SOC side, right? Is the same account name being created on multiple systems? Maybe that's normal for certain kinds of systems. Maybe servers, there's a certain account that should be created, but maybe for workstations there isn't, or maybe it's a very specific one created by a very specific individual. Going to that next point, who is the user that's creating that account? Is it a named user account or is it a service account? Does that user normally have the adequate permissions? Right? If they're using their regular, if they have admin rights and regular rights, and all of a sudden you're seeing the regular rights user, right? There's questions I should be asking about these things as well. And then, 4648 events for those explicit credentials being used, those can be helpful as well. So again, there's a couple different tools that are in your arsenal to be able to go ahead and dig into, to go ahead and leverage against this hunt. All right. We've got about 7 minutes or so left. I'm going to probably jump over the clearing audit logs. We're probably not going to get to that one, unfortunately. That was kind of the one I was like, well, it's a little bit of a reach if we were going to have time to do it. What I want to do, and what I'd like to do, is I'm going to go ahead and shoot an email off to our team that maintains our servers. I'm going to go ahead and keep server 1. So you guys have the URL up in front of you. That server 1, I'm going to try to keep up until, like, let's say Friday. The other servers that we've set up are going to be turned off. That having been said, the accounts that have been handed out to you, those accounts are that we have. So server 1 will be up. Your account is on server 1 already. We just kind of gave you different servers to log into, so we kind of load balance out across them. But server 1 will stay up till Friday. Go ahead and change that, 30 or 25 or whatever to 01. Log in with your credentials, and you can continue playing around on that server. And you can actually go through the clearing audit logs on your own from there. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to kind of hop over to my conclusion, just to kind of help sum up a few things here. Give me 1 second. All right. All right. So let's go ahead, and I'll go ahead and post in the. Perfect. Thank you. All right. So as we kind of pull this together, if I was going to put this all together towards the end here, one of our colleagues put together this diamond model around kind of what our adversary looks like. This is obviously the completed diamond model. Most of these things were uncovered in our hunt. Obviously, we didn't get into the socio-political axis piece of this, but a number of these different pieces were uncovered. And our hit during the hunt, but you can see different capabilities, different infrastructure, and how you can pivot to these to gain more information on the technical axis. Some of the adversary attributes we uncovered as well during our hunts, and again, that's kind of helps us go ahead and build out the socio-political axis, but you can see the relationships between them. We also went ahead and mapped everything to the MITRE ATT&CK model, so the ones that are in kind of weird, there's actually a tool out there called the MITRE ATT&CK Explorer, and it's pretty handy because I can go ahead and put and apply different scoring and different notes and commentary into the site and the page, and then be able to save these locally to be able to reload and kind of continue working with from there. The ones that are in green, darkest color green, have the highest score, and the way I scored these is basically if it was in one of the hunts, I kind of scored it that way. The ones that are in the red are the ones that are really showing up in like 1 or 2 hunts. But you can kind of see as we go through this with the different hunts that we do and have built out, you can see how the adversary is using these different tactics and the techniques underneath them to go ahead and achieve their operational gains and take advantage of the things they're trying to take advantage of. If we look at this from a pre-attack perspective, pre-attack, obviously we aren't looking so far as much to that left of bang, if you will, that left of exploit, but you can see how we could even pivot back, and based on some of the findings we have post-exploit, we could pivot back and start looking for the infrastructure services, the software services, the OSINT that's being used to gather some of this information before the actual exploit takes place. And so we can use both of these tools to help contextualize some of these hunts that we're doing. So what are some of the gaps, right? Because I finished my hunt overall. I want to look at this. I want to kind of go, okay, I know these things. Here are the things that I know, but I also want to, again, answer the things that I don't know, right? What don't I know? Well, if you look back over here using the attack framework, where's our biggest gap? We have nothing around credential access, right? We have nothing uncovered from that perspective. So that's kind of our biggest gap. Just kind of as we're talking about this, the reason you don't see that is because in the attack itself, we actually were using mimikatz running in memory. And I don't have any specific way of being able to pull in memory out based on the tool set that I was using, right? I could do that with other tools, and there's other tools that can do that, but that's a gap for me in the sense of what I have out here. So that might be something that I might want to think about how I can go ahead and kind of fill in the gaps from there. My privilege escalation is a little bit light. I do have the scheduled task was used for persistence. As a side note, we bypass user account control, which is another technique. But again, if that was happening in memory, that would be something that I might be blind to, at least in the current data sets that I have access to. And I didn't see a lot of discovery to date, but that's not to say that it didn't happen. It was just something that I just maybe are over the horizon that I can't see. So these could be additional hunts potentially that you could undertake. Maybe you come up dry on them, but that's also good for that gap analysis to say, what don't I know, right? I don't know what I don't know. How can I identify where those gaps are? Because if I'm handing things back to my threat intelligence analysts, right, they may have to be able to put something together, and we need to be able to kind of help explain what we saw, what we didn't see, extrapolate that, but also say we have a high degree of certainty or some level of certainty because we have a gap in these other. So where do we go from here? Well, if I look at this from a kill chain perspective, right, I might need to understand the scope and the magnitude of the penetration, depending as to what actually happened. I might want to go ahead and just learn and improve and continue to gather intelligence. It depends where we are in this and where we're finding these things, right? If we assume breach, if we live in a breach space, right, I'm going to pivot between both of these ends of the spectrum, right? I can continually be learning and gathering intelligence and operationalizing things. But at the same time, I also have to be attuned to what's happening in my environment and how do I take care of those things that have already happened that are potentially going on right now, and how do I deny and disrupt as I go. So kind of pulling all this together at the end, right, you're going to need multiple hunts to pull together a complete picture. A single picture is not going to happen just by doing one hunt, boom, we're done, right? And this hunts obviously can go in many different directions. So it's very, very important to put a boundary around your hunt, okay? Take those indicators that you found from your previous hunt and the open questions that you have, and then start a new one, okay? Bound the existing hunt, come to a conclusion, refute or confirm your hypothesis, and then start a fresh hunt, maybe taking the things you learned previously or other pieces of stimuli, and then start going from there. Operationalize those findings. Don't keep hunting the same thing over and over again. To create a count, that's great. I want to go ahead and do that. But once I learn about create a count, I want to go ahead and operationalize that so I don't have to keep searching for that. Okay, I can be able to do other things that are much more fun. Hunting's hard, right? By virtue of this, we didn't want to make everybody miserable and sit there and say, yeah, go find something that we know doesn't exist within the environment, right? We want to go ahead and put things out there that you can go find. You're not going to find everything out there, right? Because some of the hypotheses you put out there, you're just not going to find those things. You may not, and that's okay. Just understand that happens. From our perspective, obviously, we use Splunk, we use enterprise security for the context piece. There's a tool in there called Assay Investigator that, like I said, I wrote that allows me to go ahead and punch in assets or identities and look at data kind of in a tabular view and against different data sets and different silos pretty quickly. So that's something that I use to build my threat picture. We have some other things that we have out there around some content updates that potentially can provide some quick wins. But then last of all is use a model to contextualize your hunt. It can be whatever model you want to use, right? We talked about diamond, we talked about kill chain, we talked about attack. Those work for us. There's other ones that are out there. There's other things that you might do within your environment that are unique to you. Don't feel like you have to use one of the ones we talked about. Use what works for you. But these are a couple of suggestions that if you're not sure where to start, you know, these might be some good places to start as we go from there. Additional resources. We'll send out I'll go ahead and send out a link sheet. I didn't get a chance to pull it all together in time as we were making some final tweaks. But I'll send out a PDF with some links to some of the things that we've got out there. The first is that we've been building and Ryan and I co-edit the Hunting with Splunk blog series. So we've got about 23 different blogs around hunting that are out there. We've been running for over a year and continue to add to that. And so we'll send you a link out to that you guys can check those out. We also have some data sets that are out there. There's a curated data set that Ryan stood up within our environment that you can log into, and there's a blog post that goes along with that. There's some DIY that if you want to go ahead and do it yourself, we actually have the data set. There's actually a companion app that goes along with it around investigation that you can go ahead and download and play around with as well. And we'll send those links out and you guys can check those out too. All right, so we are at the top of the hour or shortly thereafter. I apologize, I don't want to keep anybody later because I know for the folks on the East Coast it's after 8 o'clock and I appreciate you guys sticking with us. We'll stick around for a couple minutes online in the chat rooms. If there's any other last-minute questions, but I want to thank you guys all for your time. Thank you for your attentiveness and the willingness to catch up with us a week before the holiday breaks and everything else that are going on. So thank you for your time, and hope it was valuable.